He lived alone in a house on the water that had long wanted to sink, until he hired a father and son team of builders. But under the rotten floor, they found something no one was supposed to see. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching from. The lake had always been quiet in the mornings. Silver Pine stretched wide and still, its mist hanging low like breath caught between dreams. On the far side, half hidden by reeds, floated a house that looked as if it had forgotten how to live. The once white walls had turned to the color of driftwood, the paint blistered by years of wind and rain. Its deck leaned slightly to one side, the windows fogged with age, the ropes that tethered it to the old wooden dock worn thin and gray. Yet somehow it stayed afloat, stubbornly defying time, as though the water itself had grown used to its weight. Thomas Reed stepped out onto the deck with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He was 50, maybe older in the light, his beard flecked with gray, his shoulders heavy with the kind of silence that accumulates when one stops expecting anyone to answer. The house creaked beneath his boots, a low sound like something alive and tired. He leaned against the railing and looked out across the water, watching the mist shift and settle again. He could feel the tilt of the floorboards, worse than yesterday. The left pontoon was sinking slowly. Not fast enough to panic, but enough to remind him that even wood gets tired of holding on. He had built this place with his wife 20 years ago. Back then, it had been a dream. A summer refuge with wide windows, bright curtains, the smell of cedar and paint always in the air. Ellen had wanted a studio by the water where she could paint for hours, while their daughter played on the deck. Thomas had worked long days, building each beam himself, believing that if he worked hard enough, he could make something that would never fall apart. But things do, especially when storms come without warning. The storm that took them had not even been the worst one that season, but it had been the one that mattered. He had never rebuilt after that. He couldn't. For 7 years, the house had floated half alive, half rotten, a relic of both love and loss. That morning, Thomas watched the ripples touch the base of the house and thought, maybe it would be better if it just went under. If the lake took it, took everything, so he wouldn't have to see it fading day after day. Yet when a stronger gust rocked the deck, his hand instinctively gripped the railing. He could not let go, not even now. The house was the only thing left of them. He was its caretaker, its prisoner, its ghost. Inside, the room still smelled faintly of her oil paint, soap, and lavender. Dust lay over everything like a soft snowfall. A cup sat on the table, a spoon inside it. Her handwriting lingered on a calendar, a single date circled in red. Summer Fair. M. The photograph beside it showed a little girl with sunlight in her hair, holding up a paintbrush like a flag. He touched the glass frame with 2 fingers, then pulled away. The lake wind moaned through the cracks in the walls. The house answered with its slow, aching sigh. Later that day, he sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the local paper. His hand shook slightly as he wrote, the pen scratching faintly. Carpenter needed for floating house repairs. Daily pay. Lodging available. It wasn't hope that drove him to it, only a quiet sense that maybe he owed the house that much, to try one more time before letting it sink for good. He mailed the notice that afternoon, and that night fell asleep, listening to the hollow tap of water against the pontoons, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. Miles away, in a smaller town that had seen better decades, a man named Ray Harper read that same notice under the weak light of a gas station lamp. He sat behind the wheel of a battered truck, his 14-year-old son asleep in the passenger seat, his head tilted against the window. Ray was 42, broad-shouldered, with the look of someone who had worked too long with his hands and too little with his heart. They had been living out of the truck for months, taking small repair jobs, patching barns, mending fences. After his wife's death the year before, Ray had stopped making plans. He just kept moving, because stopping hurt too much. His boy, Lucas, had not spoken much since the funeral. He carried a small sketchbook everywhere, and filled it with drawings of things that seemed to exist only in his memory. Houses, boats, faces half finished. Ray looked at the ad again, folded the paper, and made the call. The voice that answered was calm, distant, as if it came from underwater. The man gave no pleasantries, only directions to the lake and a quiet, "Tomorrow at noon will do." Ray agreed, hung up, and looked at his son. "We've got work, kid," he said softly, though Lucas didn't stir. The road to Silver Pine the next day was long and narrow, winding through hills and pine groves where the light broke into shards. When the truck finally reached the end of the dirt lane, the lake appeared below them, glassy and gray. The house floated near the far edge, tethered by a single dock. Lucas pressed his face to the window, whispering almost to himself, "It's floating." Ray nodded, half impressed, half uneasy. "Yeah," he muttered, "and looks like it's about to stop." Thomas was waiting at the dock when they arrived. He stood straight but still, like a tree long accustomed to wind. Ray climbed out, introduced himself, offered a firm handshake. Thomas returned it with a nod. Lucas followed, silent, his eyes scanning every angle of the strange house. How it leaned, how the ropes groaned, how the reflection seemed steadier than the real thing. Inside, the air was cool and damp. The walls were lined with framed photographs and faded paintings. A child's shoes sat neatly by the door, untouched by dust, as if waiting for small feet that would never return. Ray said nothing but looked around with the cautious respect of a man entering a church. Thomas led them through each room, explaining where the beams had weakened, where the wood had gone soft. His voice carried no emotion, only fact. When they reached the lower level, Ray crouched and pressed a palm to the damp boards. "You'll need a full replacement down here," he said. "She's not going to last another season." Thomas looked past him, out through the small round window to the water below. "I know," he said quietly. "Just make sure she lasts until then." Ray agreed to start the next morning. Payment was fair, if not generous. There was a spare bedroom upstairs with 2 narrow beds, clean sheets, though the smell of mildew lingered. Lucas dropped his bag there and opened the window. The lake air rolled in, cool and heavy. For a moment, he thought he could hear something, a faint, hollow hum from below, like breathing. That evening, the 3 of them shared a meal. It was quiet except for the sound of forks and the occasional creak of the house adjusting to the night. Thomas spoke only once, to ask how old the boy was. 14, Ray said. Grew up around tools. Thomas nodded, but said nothing more. Lucas kept his eyes on the plate, though his mind was elsewhere. On the photo he'd seen in the hallway of a girl about his age standing by the lake. He wondered who she was, and why her picture was everywhere. After dinner, the sun fell behind the pines, and the house seemed to sink deeper into the lake's reflection. Ray stood on the deck smoking a cigarette, while Thomas checked the mooring lines. Lucas sat near the edge, sketchbook in hand, drawing the silhouette of the house mirrored in the water. The reflection wavered with each ripple, like the house itself was breathing through the lake. When he was done, he wrote beneath it in small letters, "When the house holds, we do too." He didn't know where the phrase came from, but it felt right. Thomas passed by and noticed the drawing. He stopped. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, quietly, "She used to draw it like that." Lucas looked up, uncertain. Thomas's gaze had drifted far away, past the trees, past the years. "My daughter," he said finally. She thought the house was alive. He turned and went inside. That night, the house groaned under the shifting wind. The water slapped gently against the pontoons. Ray slept deeply from exhaustion. Lucas lay awake, listening to the sounds, half afraid, half comforted. Somewhere below, the old wood murmured, as if the lake were whispering secrets through the cracks. He thought about the man downstairs, alone for so long, and about his own father, who spoke little, but carried sadness like a second skin. Maybe this place was meant for people like them, people who hadn't learned yet how to let go. In the morning, mist rolled in thicker than before, turning the world white. The lake was invisible beyond the deck rail, the air wet and cold. Ray was already at work, hammer in hand. Thomas moved silently beside him, pulling out rusted nails, handing over boards. Lucas fetched tools and nails, trying to help. Hours passed in rhythm, the pounding, the scraping, the hiss of the saw. Every strike seemed to echo inside the hollow house like a heartbeat waking after a long sleep. By evening, they were sitting together again on the deck, faces lined with sawdust and sweat. The mist had lifted, and the sunset painted the lake gold. For the first time, Thomas allowed himself a small smile. "It's still floating," Ray said. Thomas nodded. "Maybe it remembers how." Lucas wrote the words in his sketchbook, underlined them, then closed it carefully. When night fell, the house was quiet again. Only the soft lap of water against its sides broke the silence. Inside, a single lamp burned near the window, casting light over the photographs and the dust. Outside, the reflection trembled gently, but the house did not move. It seemed, for the first time in years, to be holding steady. And though none of them said it aloud, each man felt it, the sense that something had shifted, that maybe the house wasn't the only thing trying to stay afloat. The next chapter of their lives had already begun, quietly, beneath the surface of the water. The days settled into rhythm, the kind that makes a man forget how long he has been standing still. Each morning began the same way, the sound of boots on damp boards, the clink of nails in a tin bucket, and the low murmur of men working without needing to speak. The sun rose over Silverpine Lake like a pale coin, catching on the ripples that spread around the floating house. Thomas was always the first to wake. He would light the old stove, boil water, and pour 3 cups of coffee. One for himself, one for Ray, and one for the boy. He never asked if Lucas liked coffee. The gesture was what mattered. At first, the boy only nodded his thanks, wrapping both hands around the warm cup. But by the end of the first week, he had begun to take small sips, eyes half hidden under his fringe of hair. The repairs were difficult, and the house resisted them like an old body unaccustomed to movement. The beams creaked when pried, the nails broke off in their holes, and every time they thought they'd fixed a leak, another appeared 2 boards away. Yet slowly, imperceptibly, the structure began to change. The deck no longer tilted as much. The ropes no longer strained under the house's weight. The air smelled less of mildew and more of fresh wood and pine tar. Thomas could feel it too. When he walked across the deck, he no longer felt the same sinking dread that had haunted him for years. The house was beginning to breathe again. Ray worked like a man who had forgotten how to rest. He spoke little, except to give directions or curse softly under his breath when a tool slipped. But there was something steady about him, a kind of quiet resilience that Thomas found oddly comforting. They were both men who had outlived the best parts of their stories. They didn't need to talk to understand each other. They just kept their heads down and let the sound of hammer and saw speak for them. In the evenings, when the tools were put away, they would sit on the deck, looking out at the darkening lake, each lost in his own silence. Sometimes Thomas would think of Elin and the child they'd buried in the water, without a grave, and he would feel something unclench inside his chest. Not peace, but an ache that no longer frightened him. Lucas was different. He did not work with the same weary focus as the adults. His attention drifted from task to task, his eyes always moving, studying, searching. He carried that small sketchbook everywhere, the pages smudged with graphite and fingerprints. When he thought no one was watching, he would sit cross-legged on the deck and draw boats, trees, faces, the reflection of the house on the lake. One evening, Thomas came up behind him and saw what he was sketching. The three of them, sitting in silence, each figure leaning a little differently, but all facing the same horizon. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching the pencil move. The boy had captured something he hadn't realized existed, a fragile thread between them, stretched across their shared loneliness. As days turned into weeks, the lake began to thaw from its winter chill. Ducks returned to the reeds, and the air grew softer. With every repair, Thomas found himself thinking less of how the house had died, and more of how it might live. He began sanding the railings, repainting the shutters, fixing small things no one had asked him to. When Ray noticed, he didn't comment, just handed him a brush. Lucas watched all this quietly, sensing a shift he couldn't explain. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt patient. It was Lucas who found the hatch. It happened late one afternoon while Ray was replacing the last of the damaged beams beneath the deck, and Thomas was busy sorting through old boxes of tools. The boy had been exploring the narrow corridor between the kitchen and the small back room, a space cluttered with old furniture and stacks of books long swollen with moisture. He was tracing his fingers along the floorboards when he heard a hollow sound, different from the rest. Curious, he tapped again. Beneath the layer of warped wood, something echoed. He brushed away the dust and saw a rusted iron ring embedded in the floor. He hesitated, listening. The air below seemed to hum faintly, as if the house itself were breathing from underneath. He knelt, pulled on the ring, and the trapdoor gave way with a reluctant groan. The smell that rose from below was cold and earthy. He saw the beginning of a narrow staircase descending into shadows. A thin sheen of water reflected the dim light. He hesitated only a moment before going down. The steps creaked beneath his weight, and droplets fell from the ceiling, tapping softly against the boards. At the bottom, the air was thick and still. Wooden crates were stacked along the walls, their edges warped, the labels long faded. Water covered the floor in a shallow pool. Lucas crouched beside one of the boxes and pried open the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were old letters, photographs, and small objects he didn't recognize. A child's shoe, a porcelain doll missing an eye, a bundle of paintbrushes bound by a ribbon gone pale with age. He lifted a photograph. It showed a man, a woman, and a young girl standing beside the lake, sunlight flooding their faces. The man looked like Thomas. Lucas felt his heart beat faster. He took the photo and climbed back up. When he entered the main room, Thomas and Ray were sitting at the table, their conversation quiet and sparse. The boy laid the photograph down between them. Thomas froze. The color drained from his face. He reached out with trembling hands and picked it up, as if afraid it might disintegrate. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely more than breath. Lucas pointed to the floor. "Down there," he said. "There's a room under the house. It's full of things." For a moment, Thomas didn't move. Then he stood, the chair scraping the floor, and crossed the room. He stopped at the open hatch, looking down into the darkness as though staring into a wound. "I locked that door years ago," he murmured. Ray stepped closer, frowning. "What's down there?" Thomas didn't answer. His eyes glistened in the dim light. "My life," he whispered. "Everything I buried." Later that evening, when the tools were put away, and the lake had gone still again, Thomas told them the truth. They sat near the old stove, while the flames cast flickering shapes across the walls. He spoke quietly, as if afraid the house might overhear. He told them about Hélène, how she had loved the water, how she had painted it every morning, saying the lake changed colors like a living thing. He told them about their daughter, Marie, and how she used to sit on the deck feeding crumbs to the ducks. The day of the storm had been bright, deceptively so. He had been on the mainland buying supplies when the wind rose suddenly. By the time he reached the dock, the boat was gone. They found it the next day, overturned near the far cove. After that, Ellen never painted again. She died less than a year later, and Thomas, unable to face the sight of her studio, packed everything she'd touched into the lower chamber and sealed it away. "I thought if I hid it," he said, staring into the fire, "I could stop it from hurting. But all I did was let it rot with the house." No one spoke for a long time. The fire cracked softly. Lucas watched the shadows move across Thomas's face, seeing in him not just an old man, but something fragile, something that could finally break. When he spoke, his voice was small but sure. "If you hide memories," he said, "they don't die. They just wait." Thomas turned to him, startled by the words. For a moment their eyes met. One man who had lost too much. One boy who was learning what loss meant. It was the beginning of something neither could name. From that night on, the house felt different. Thomas no longer avoided the lower level. Together they began to clean it out, one box at a time. Most of what had been stored there was beyond saving. The damp had ruined the papers. The photographs had blurred into ghosts. But some things endured. Lucas found a small tin of watercolors still intact, the pigment inside dried, but vibrant. He showed it to Thomas, who smiled faintly for the first time in years. "She used those," he said. "She said painting was how she made silence less empty." Lucas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He carried the tin upstairs and left it on the windowsill, where the morning light could find it again. As the days passed, the three of them worked side by side. Ray fixed the lower beams, while Thomas sanded the railings. Lucas fetched nails and boards, sometimes sitting cross-legged to sketch the lake, or the reflections dancing across the walls. When he drew, the house seemed quieter, as if listening. Even Ray noticed. "Feels lighter here," he said one evening. Thomas nodded. Maybe it needed a few hands to remember it was worth saving. The man's voice no longer sounded hollow. There was warmth in it, faint but real. The storm came 3 nights later. It arrived without warning, as they often did in that valley. The wind began as a low moan, rising through the trees until it became a roar. The lake churned, black and wild, slamming against the pontoons. Thomas woke first, the house rocking beneath him. He stumbled to the deck and saw one of the mooring ropes snap, flinging spray into the air. "Ray!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind. The carpenter rushed out, grabbing a lantern. Together, they fought to tie the lines, their hands slipping on wet rope. Lightning flashed, illuminating the water like a field of broken glass. Then Thomas realized Lucas was gone. Panic cut through the storm's noise. "He's inside!" Ray yelled, but Thomas was already running. He found the hatch open, rain pouring down the steps. The lower chamber was half flooded, the water swirling around crates and debris. Lucas stood waist-deep in it, clutching the photograph album he'd found days earlier. "They'll drown," the boy cried. Thomas waded in after him. "Let them go, Lucas," he shouted. "It's just paper." "It's not," the boy screamed back. "It's them!" For a heartbeat, Thomas saw not the boy, but his daughter, small, stubborn, standing in the wind with her hair whipping across her face. Something inside him cracked. He lunged forward, grabbed the boy by the arm, and pulled him up the stairs as water surged behind them. The house groaned, the beams straining, the lake trying to reclaim what was once its own. They burst into the main room, soaked and gasping. Thomas slammed the hatch shut, sealing the darkness below. The storm raged until dawn. They could do nothing but wait, listening to the house shudder with each gust. At times, Thomas thought it would tear apart, yet somehow it held. When morning came, the air was clear, washed clean. The sun rose over the lake, and in its reflection the house still stood tilted, battered, but floating. The water that had invaded the lower level slowly drained back through the cracks. Inside, the air smelled of salt and damp wood. The photographs and letters were gone, lost to the depths. Thomas walked down the steps and stood ankle-deep in the water, staring at the empty space where the boxes had been. For the first time, he didn't feel anger or grief, only relief. "Maybe it's better this way," he said softly. The house wanted to breathe. When he came back up, Ray was sitting on the deck, his face drawn but calm. Lucas sat beside him, wrapped in a blanket, eyes wide but steady. Thomas joined them. For a while they said nothing. The water lapped gently against the sides, no longer violent, only tired. Then Thomas spoke, his voice low. "I think I've been trying to hold on to a house that wanted to move on." Ray nodded slowly. "Happens to people too." Lucas looked out at the lake. The surface shimmered, reflecting the broken clouds. He took out his sketchbook, opened it to a blank page, and began to draw again. Lines, sure, deliberate. When he finished, he turned the page toward them. It was the house, straight and bright, standing in calm water beneath a clear sky. Thomas looked at it for a long time. "You drew it how it should be," he said. "No," Lucas replied quietly. "How it wants to be." Thomas smiled then, small but real. The wind rustled through the reeds, and the house answered with a soft, weary creak, as if agreeing. The storm had taken what was left of the past, but it had given something back, an ending that felt almost like a beginning. By the time the sun climbed high, the house had dried, the ropes were tightened, and the men had resumed their work. Life, it seemed, was returning one nail at a time. The lake was still. The air smelled of pine and fresh wood. And somewhere beneath their feet, beneath the boards and beams, the voices of those who had once lived there had finally found rest. The lake was still in the early light, a sheet of pewter glass stretching endlessly beneath the soft morning haze. The storm had passed days ago, leaving behind a silence that felt less like absence and more like renewal. The floating house, battered but upright, rose from the reflection like a survivor catching its breath. The smell of wet wood had given way to that of sawdust and varnish, and though the lower chamber had been stripped bare by the flood, the air now carried the clean promise of new beginnings. The water that had once seemed intent on swallowing the house now held it gently, as if even the lake had decided it had suffered enough. Inside, sunlight pooled on the floorboards through the cracked window panes, turning every droplet and nailhead into a spark. The house no longer groaned like an old wound. It breathed, steady and rhythmic, as though it had rediscovered its heartbeat. Thomas stood on the deck, watching Ray and Lucas as they worked below the railing. The carpenter was bent over a plank, his movements methodical. Sure. The boy knelt beside him, sanding a smaller piece of wood, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. It was a small sight, nothing extraordinary. But for Thomas, it carried a strange gravity. Months ago, he had believed the world had shrunk to the dimensions of this house, a floating coffin filled with ghosts. Now, looking at those two figures, one man who knew how to rebuild what was broken, one boy who had reminded him what it meant to feel. He realized the house had never been meant for solitude. It had always been waiting for hands like theirs. Ray noticed him watching and lifted his head with a faint grin. "If you're going to stand there all morning, at least bring the nails," he said. Thomas smirked and fetched the tin box from the workbench. The banter between them was easy now, the kind that came naturally to men who had shared danger and survived it. When Thomas handed over the nails, Ray nodded toward the horizon. "Weather looks good," he said. "Maybe this place finally decided to make peace with the lake." Thomas chuckled. "Or maybe it's just tired of fighting." Lucas straightened, wiping sawdust from his hands. "It's not fighting," he said quietly. "It's floating." His tone was simple, but there was something in it, a certainty that belonged to someone older than his years. Thomas looked at him, remembering the boy waist-deep in stormwater, clutching the photograph album like it was life itself. The memory no longer hurt. It simply existed, like a scar that didn't ache anymore. He nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "It's floating." By noon, the repairs were almost complete. The lower beams had been reinforced, the deck polished smooth. They had rebuilt the stair railing and repainted the shutters, using the leftover blue that Thomas found in a half-rusted tin in the attic. It was the same color Ellen had once chosen, the color of the lake just before sunset, when it held the world's last light. When the paint dried, the house looked different. Still old, still imperfect, but alive in a way it hadn't been in years. The water reflected it clearly, as though proud to cradle its shape. They ate lunch together on the deck, bread, apples, and coffee brewed over a small camp stove. The air was warm and still. A heron glided low over the lake, its shadow brushing the water like a whisper. Thomas leaned back in his chair, breathing deeply. "You ever think about staying in one place for good?" he asked. Ray chewed thoughtfully. "Sometimes. But moving's easier than staying. Places remember you. That can be heavy." Thomas smiled faintly. "Some memories are worth the wait." Ray looked at him then, really looked, and something like understanding passed between them. Both men knew what it meant to live among ghosts, and both knew the quiet miracle of building something that might outlast them. Lucas, listening, said nothing. He was sketching in his notebook again. His pencil moved quickly, the lines clean and sure. Thomas glanced over his shoulder and saw what he was drawing. The house as it looked now, straight and gleaming, with 3 small figures on the deck. Beneath it, the reflection was not of water, but of hands, broad human hands holding it up. Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. "What will you call it?" he asked. Lucas paused. "The house that stands on people," he said simply. That night, after they had finished their work, the 3 sat by the water's edge. The stars came out slowly, scattered and soft. The lake mirrored them perfectly, so that it seemed as if the house floated between 2 skies. The only sounds were the soft hum of crickets and the occasional creak of wood settling into comfort. Thomas felt a peace he hadn't known since before the storm that took his family. It wasn't the peace of forgetting. It was the peace of acceptance. The past was still there. Ellen's laughter, Marie's small footprints across the deck, but it no longer pulled him under. It drifted beside him like the boats on the water, close enough to touch, far enough to let go. When morning came, the work was done. The house no longer leaned. The pontoon sat level. The deck caught the sunlight evenly, and even the air inside seemed clearer. It smelled of cedar and clean water. Ray was packing his tools into the truck, and Lucas was folding his drawings, tucking them carefully into his backpack. Thomas stood nearby, unsure what to say. He had imagined this moment would come with sadness, but instead it felt natural, like the tide receding after doing its work. "I can't pay you what this job is worth," he said. Ray closed the truck door and shook his head. You already did. He glanced toward his son. This place did more for him than any doctor could have. Lucas smiled faintly, shy but steady. It's not just the house, he said. It's you. Thomas swallowed hard. You helped it remember what it was, he said. And me, too. They lingered a little longer, not wanting to break the spell. Then Lucas pulled something from his pocket, a small piece of wood, sanded smooth and carved with careful hands. He had written words across it with a pocket knife. The house that stands on people. Without a word, he walked to the edge of the dock and placed it gently on the water. The small plank drifted away, spinning slowly in the current, catching the sunlight as it went. Thomas watched it until it disappeared among the reeds. He's a good boy, he said softly. Ray nodded. He's getting there. When they drove away later that afternoon, the sound of the truck faded into the distance, leaving only the wind and the low murmur of the lake. Thomas stood on the deck long after they were gone, his hands resting on the railing, the sun warm on his back. He could hear the faint creak of the wood beneath him, but it no longer sounded like pain. It was the sound of a house alive again, adjusting to its new weight, the weight of memory, of purpose, of people who had come and changed it. Weeks passed. Spring gave way to early summer, and the lake grew busier. Fishermen paddled past, waving. Sometimes they called out to ask about the repairs, and Thomas would smile and say the house had learned to stay upright. He spent his days tending to small things, repainting the trim, planting flowers in old buckets, fixing the wind chime Elin had made years ago. At night, he would sit by the window and read, the lantern light flickering against the glass. He still thought of the storm, of what had been lost. But those thoughts no longer hollowed him out. They filled him instead, quietly, like rain seeping into dry ground. One afternoon, as he was sweeping the deck, he saw a figure walking down the path that led to the dock. It was the postman, carrying a thin envelope. "Got something for you, Mr. Reed," he said. Thomas thanked him, puzzled. He rarely received mail. He took the envelope inside and sat at the table before opening it. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, but neat. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a drawing. It was Lucas's hand, unmistakably. The picture showed the house standing straight on the lake, sunlight spilling over it, and beneath the water, more of those hands holding it steady. Across the bottom, written in pencil, were the words, "Project Rebirth. You taught me that memories don't have to drown." Thomas read the message twice, then 3 times, until the letters blurred. He set it down carefully, framed it between his palms, and smiled. Outside, the afternoon light shimmered across the water. He could hear the faint buzz of insects, the lap of the waves against the pontoons, the faraway call of a bird. The world had returned to its rhythm, and so had he. That evening, as the sun slid behind the trees, Thomas brewed tea and carried it to the deck. The air was golden, the surface of the lake perfectly still. The house cast a long reflection that touched the reeds on the far shore. He sipped slowly, watching the colors shift from gold to rose to violet. The sky darkened, and stars began to appear one by one. He thought of Ray and Lucas, somewhere down the road, maybe sitting together like this, maybe remembering the same quiet water. He thought of Ellen, her laughter, her paint-stained hands, and of Marie, the small voice that once called him Papa across the deck. They were gone, but not lost. They lived here now, in the wood, in the air, in the calm that finally filled him. As night deepened, Thomas rose and walked to the edge of the dock. The small plank that Lucas had set afloat was gone, but he could almost imagine it out there still, drifting somewhere under the stars. The reflection of the house shimmered below him, bright and unwavering. He closed his eyes and whispered to the lake, "Thank you for holding me." When he looked up again, the moon had climbed high, its light silvering the railings and turning the water to glass. The house stood steady, the ropes slack but secure. A gentle wind stirred the curtains inside. For the first time in years, Thomas didn't feel the pull of the past dragging him down. He felt anchored, not to grief, but to the quiet strength of what remained. He turned back toward the door, his steps slow and sure. Inside, the light from the lantern cast a warm glow on the walls, flickering like a heartbeat. The house answered each creak of the floor with its own soft echo, a conversation between the living and the remembered. As he settled into his chair by the window, the drawing from Lucas hung beside him, catching the moonlight. The words beneath it gleamed faintly. "You taught me that memories don't have to drown." He read them once more, then let his eyes drift to the water outside. The lake reflected everything, the stars, the sky, the past, the present. It held them all without drowning any. Thomas smiled, the kind of smile that comes not from joy, but from peace. "We're still floating," he murmured, and the boards beneath his feet seemed to agree. The night deepened around the house, wrapping it in gentle quiet. Somewhere, an owl called. The lake whispered softly against the wood. And in that tender, endless rhythm, the breath of the lake, the creak of the house, the steady beat of a heart learning to love the world again. Thomas Reed finally understood that the house had never really been his to save. It had been saving him all along. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next story waiting for you right now. There are so many more worth discovering. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.